So last week we looked at a Universal film that was shot at Disneyland in 1962. About 20 minutes of scenes inside the park. We also looked at how Walt, careful to manage the park's image, required Curtis Entertainment to allow him to review footage of the park and remove certain scenes or shots. The film was a modest success, with some lovely footage at the park, but the previous year, there was a film project by a far more famous director, who also had his eyes set on an extended sequence at Disneyland, a sequence that would turn the happiest place on earth from mostly innocent fun to a place touched with the after-memories of murder. The director was Alfred Hitchcock. As he was also the host of a weekly TV anthology series, he was the second most famous movie producer in America, right after Walt Disney. In 1960 and 61, he was basking in the glow of one of his greatest financial and artistic successes, the landmark film Psycho, a mid-budget work of suspense that managed to become the second highest-grossing film of the year. Though earlier Hitchcock films had suggested violence, Psycho offered a minute-and-a-half murder scene arranged inside of a hotel shower that, with artful direction, graphically defined the terror inside the Bates Motel. The highest-grossing film for that year was still Spartacus, a traditional Hollywood epic with biblical overtones, and the highest-grossing family film was Swiss Family Robinson, at number 4 overall from Disney. But Psycho represented an expansion of the film genres produced within mainstream Hollywood, a suggestion that Americans were about to leave behind some of the innocence of the 1950s. The next project that Hitch wanted to pursue wouldn't follow in the graphic tradition of Psycho. It would be a big-budget film, developed at his office over on the Paramount lot with famous stars, lush sets, and elegant costumes, much in the manner of North by Northwest and Rear Window. But with Psycho, the image of a Hitchcock production was changing, and that new image had the potential to create a barrier between Hitchcock and the location central to the film's drama, where he wanted to stage one central sequence in his next project. Today we have a story about Disneyland, a story about how Walt managed the park's image, but also a story about Hollywood and one of its greatest directors. There are some interesting intersections between the life and art of Walt Disney and Alfred Hitchcock, even though the themes explored in their films couldn't have been more different. Hitch explored issues of psychological suspense, often related to murder, while Walt explored themes of history, fantasy, and often the lives of underdogs excluded by society. But beyond these differences, there were some interesting artistic and personal connections. Hitchcock was an admirer of Disney's work. One of his biographers explained that later in life, in his private screening room, Hitch would often watch Disney films, also those featuring James Bond. But the connections between Hitch and Disney animation go back to his early years. In his 1936 film, Sabotage, Hitchcock included Disney animation in a pivotal scene. After learning of her younger brother's death, a woman walks into a theater to find children watching the Disney cartoon Who Killed Cock Robin, a film that momentarily relieves her grief until Cock Robin is shot with an arrow and returns her to her real-life emotions of grief. It was a message that cartoons have the power to both remove us from our troubles, but also to return them as well. But the more meaningful connections between Hitch and Disney were focused on how they thought about film, their role as producers, and the evolution of entertainment over the 20th century. Hitchcock was one of the first to use the Disney-arranged technique of storyboarding for live-action films. As many early animators came up out of illustration and newspaper comics, it was natural for the Disney studio, with its emphasis on story, to use a system that looked like a multi-panel comic strip to plan out their pictures. In those early years, more so than live action, animation was a visual art in which animators could plan out movement and gesture so the visual information communicated the story with precision to the audience. A few early directors believed this tool could also transform how live-action films, with their own visual grammar, used images to communicate nuances in storytelling to an audience. Among those directors, rather famously, was Hitchcock. But beyond those visual elements, Walt and Hitch saw the goals of storytelling from a similar perspective in terms of how a movie shares or doesn't share information with an audience. Throughout his life, Hitch felt that the public, or at least some of them, misunderstood him as a producer of mysteries, whereas Hitch himself felt that he was a producer of thrillers based on suspense. In a 1971 TV interview, he explained, quote, "Mystery means withholding information from an audience, whereas suspense means giving them information. Otherwise, if they don't have the information, they have nothing to be suspended about." Hitchcock believed that the audience should have as much information as the protagonist, similar to how point of view works in a novel. In another interview, Hitch said, quote, "You should never confuse a whodunit with suspense. A whodunit is an intellectual exercise, but the suspense story gives the audience full information before you start. In a suspense, you tell the audience there's a bomb on the train. Then they wait for it to go off." If the protagonist knew something important concerning the story, so would the audience. Suspense came from working alongside the protagonist, usually into a situation of danger. Quote, "If an audience doesn't know the source of trouble," Hitch said, "how can they emote?" For Hitchcock, narrative was a tool to guide an audience into an emotional state, not a puzzle to be solved or a story to deliver information. This was, according to longtime Disney screenwriter Larry Watkin, nearly identical to Walt's understanding of how narratives should unfold on the screen. According to Watkin, when stories were in production, Walt believed that nothing should be withheld from an audience. Quote, "Let them in on it," Disney used to say. "Wind it all up, then let it go." Watkin's impression was that, quote, "if an audience could say, 'Hey, I'll bet I know what's going to happen next,' that suited Walt." But some of the most interesting connections between the two men concerned theme parks. Hitchcock saw theme parks as a type of storytelling experience related to movies. For Hitch, movies were a tool that, when watched, produced potent emotions in a viewer, such as suspense, fear, and terror. He saw the tools of a theme park as deeply related to movies. That is, for Hitch, story information wasn't the end result of the film experience. The movie didn't exist so that viewers could understand the story. Rather, story was the tool so that viewers could have a powerful, if temporary, emotional experience. Quote, "People like to be scared in a film," he said, "just as much as they go to Disneyland and feel the emotions that are presented there." Starting in the 1950s, Hitch saw amusement park and theme park attractions in this light as well, as a set of experiences specifically arranged so that writers produced targeted emotions. Quote, "Art is emotion," Hitch said. In this view, it doesn't matter so much what happens on a theme park ride, or even if a writer remembers the details, but rather if those details, when experienced, create a heightened emotional response, something far outside of regular everyday life. This, essentially, was what Romantic poets were attempting to accomplish in the 19th century, to find language that would lift a reader out of his or her daily life to sample powerful emotions of elation or even despair. In this regard, for Hitch, designers of theme park attractions were creating a type of poetry, an experience that produces a compelling emotional response. Quote, "Sometimes one can almost say that the man who builds a roller coaster is an artist," Hitch explained. "The grades and dives that he puts into it creates the crudest emotions in the rider." In this view, there's a type of poetry in roller coaster construction. The first hill with the slow climb is designed to produce fear and apprehension, typically followed by the largest, fastest drop on the track. Any big thrills are usually early in the ride, in which riders face fears of inversion, weightlessness, and high speed. The thrills in the second half of most roller coaster experiences are typically more mild in comparison, a chance for riders to revel in the fact that they've just overcome their fear of the big drop or the double loop or whatever it might be. The ride creates pleasurable anxiety, but then continues with tamer thrills, allowing riders an experience of relief, so that even if they've entered the ride with trepidation, after the second half of the roller coaster experience, they've had enough time to feel that they've overcome the worrisome part of the adventure to leave the experience joyful and laughing. In roller coasters, this is a form that produces both fear and elation, suspense and release, with both emotions experienced typically within 3 minutes. And this concept is not far outside of how poets in the 19th century thought about language being a means toward creating rarefied emotional experience. It was also not far from Hitch's own understanding of narrative structure. One story that Hitch repeatedly told was the lesson he learned from his 1936 film, Sabotage. He felt this film contained a deep narrative flaw. The suspense in the film is created by the audience knowing that a bomb carried by a young boy would go off at 1:30 in the afternoon. Only the boy was delayed on the bus, which was designed to raise the level of anxiety felt by the audience as they hoped for the boy's safety. Only in that film, the bomb went off, killing the child. There was suspense in that film, a lot of it. Only there was no release, no sense of having overcome trouble. Hitch believed that this structure of the bomb going off and killing the boy, though realistic, was unsatisfying in a film, as an audience wanted release after emotions crescendoed through the drama. Only in this particular 1936 film, the release from that suspense never arrived. Instead of overcoming trouble, the film ended in tragedy, which the audience, for the most part, didn't find satisfying. From there, Hitch saw the shape of his films as suspense followed by release. And if art, in his mind, was any experience designed to deliver calculated emotions to an audience, this was also the exact emotional design arranged by most roller coasters. But beyond the framework of theme park rides, Hitch believed that the type of attraction at a Disney park might merge more closely with film to create what we'd now call an immersive experience that might eventually be a more powerful way to convey emotion than film. He thought that Disney's new technologies and design strategies, such as animatronics and show buildings deeply decorated like movie sets, after maturing might reach a point where they too could be an artistic system to directly deliver emotions to guests. Quote, "The old boy is on to something," Hitch said about Walt. "This just may be the theater of the future. I see the possibility that maybe, in the distant future, that when people go to be entertained at the theater, they go into a big darkened auditorium and they are mass hypnotized. Instead of identifying themselves with someone on the screen, they are that person. And when they buy their ticket, they choose which character they want to be. Through hypnotism, the story is injected into them. They suffer the agonies and so forth." Though Hitch didn't nail the technology, he did have a reasonable idea as to the future of Disney attractions. What Hitch was describing way back in 1964, shortly after the Tiki Birds premiered at Disneyland and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln debuted at the World's Fair, was using new technology to create immersive experiences in which guests didn't merely watch an attraction, but participated in it. This, over time, wouldn't come from mass hypnosis. Rather, from creating show sets as believable as cinema, such as in Rise of the Resistance, or through VR and 3D experiences, such as in Flight of Passage. But in terms of a business model, The most meaningful connection between the two men was in their early adoption of TV, even during a period in which theater owners threatened to boycott films made by those producers, directors, and studios who also created TV programming, as theaters saw the small screen as a tremendous threat to their business model. Not only did Walt and Hitch produce shows for the small screen, they used the opportunity to present themselves to the audience, an opportunity through which they became celebrities. Ironically, through the small screen, Walt and Hitch became the two best-known and best-recognized producers for work they created on the big screen in the 1950s and 1960s. For a dozen years, Walt hosted just over 300 episodes of his weekly TV series with an on-screen total of over 600 minutes, or roughly 10 hours, making his image more familiar than many lead actors. His lead-ins were shot in groups, typically 7 or 8 at a time, on a soundstage where art director Stan Joly had recreated his third-floor office. Walt was conscious of cost and often shot his lead-in when an existing production crew had downtime. At times, he wore costumes, he joked with friends such as Jack Benny, but the introductions with animals were among the most memorable. According to one Disney-produced document, these animal lead-ins with Walt weren't without incident. Quote, Walt had his finger nipped by an overly playful bear cub. A tiger went to sleep under the warm stage light waiting for his big scene, and a frisky puppy was caught carrying off a squalling duckling, which had to be rescued just in time. But those intros in which Walt hammed it up, joked around, and petted a tiger next to his desk presented a warm image of the man behind the studio, an image that helped define the Disney experience, or as we might now say, the Disney brand. Walt shot new lead-ins from 1954 through 1966. Hitchcock's run was nearly as long. Like Walt, Hitch moved into TV production, creating Alfred Hitchcock Presents when theater owners still considered it a taboo for film producers to work with their competition, network TV. Quote, I am contributing to my own downfall, Hitch said. Audiences are losing the cinema habit. They're staying home and watching little shows on little screens. In a speech for the Producers Guild, he turned the affair into a dark joke. Quote, the invention of the television, he said, can be compared to the introduction of indoor plumbing. Fundamentally, it brought no change to the public's habits. It simply eliminated the necessity of leaving the house. Theater owners, no doubt, weren't amused. He hosted his weekly show from 55 to 65. For a typical lead-in, he stood before the camera and spoke in a droll voice. With gallows humor, he explained the terrible things, typically murder, that were about to take place on the screen. Beyond a like-minded approach to art and a like-minded appreciation of theme park attractions, in 1960 and early 1961, Hitchcock, along with screenwriter Ernest Lehman, explored the possibility of filming a significant part of a new movie at Disneyland, with most of the action taking place on the streets of Frontierland. But notes suggest that the segment ideally would also include other areas of the park, such as the burning cabin on the river, that blended unsettling images of fantasy in such a way that they merged with reality. The concept started with Lehman, but Hitch quickly warmed to it. In 1959, Hitchcock released North by Northwest, a film that was written by Lehman. It wasn't the highest-grossing film of the year. That spot belonged to Ben-Hur, a historical epic with biblical overtones. The number 2 spot belonged to The Shaggy Dog, a family comedy released by Disney. Still, North by Northwest held a very respectable and very profitable 9th place on the list of highest-grossing movies that year. The story of an ad man who is mistaken for a federal agent by foreign spies who intend to kill him. Hitch often worked on multiple projects simultaneously, exploring story ideas for one script while another was moving into production. In September 1960, Hitch released Psycho, a film with a modest budget that managed to become the second highest-grossing film of the year. It also represented a shift in viewer appetites. With its iconic murder scene arranged in a hotel shower, Psycho offered graphic violence presented with artful direction not previously accepted by a mass audience. In terms of topics and material, Psycho was an outlier in that year's most popular films. The highest-grossing film for the year was Spartacus, another Hollywood epic with biblical overtones. And the highest-grossing family film was Swiss Family Robinson, at number 4 overall for Disney. Though over the previous 2 decades, Hitch had seen his films rank in the number 4 and number 3 positions, he had never had a hit as large as Psycho, a film that outperformed far more lavish projects created by other producers. Psycho not only elevated Hitchcock's notoriety in Hollywood, it also suggested that the American public was ready to explore grittier and more realistic portrayals of violence than had been featured in cinema in the 1950s. 1 month after the release of Psycho, even while Hitch was overseas to promote the international release of the film, Lehman began work on a new script for Hitch with a substantial set piece arranged at Disneyland. The script was called The Blind Man. At the start of October, by himself at home, Lehman had a vision for a story, a concept that bit by bit drew him into its narrative space. That first night, for hours, he sketched out possibilities on a yellow legal pad until, exhausted at 3 a.m., he went to bed. What if a man was murdered, though the murder was staged to look like an accident? And what if that man was also an organ donor? And what if his eyes were given to a blind man who, after the transplant surgery, at times had flashes of the murder itself?
There's a charming old wives' tale that suggests the last thing a dying man sees will remain imprinted on his retina forever after. Let us suppose that the dying man in question is the victim of murder. It is perfectly reasonable to assume, is it not, that the last thing he sees would be his killer.
In Lehman's early conception, the film would star Jimmy Stewart, who by that time had worked in 4 Hitchcock projects. He was an actor that Hitch liked, one with whom Hitch would like to work again. Beyond this, Stewart had a mannerism that Lehman felt he could use in the film. Jimmy Stewart tended to stare at other actors as though he were trying to visually understand their personalities. He was an actor who naturally relied on visual information to take in the world. He would be an ideal person to play a blind man who recently finds sight. And what if this blind man, who was prone to stare just like Jimmy Stewart, saw the donor's murderer one day while about town and sensed there was a connection? Even on that first night, Lehman wrote down that the blind man, as he was living in Los Angeles, would want to see one of the area's newest wonders. When asked what he wanted to see with his new eyes, he would respond that he wanted to see the world, but first Disneyland. Only in a Hitchcock film, the trip to Walt's Park wouldn't be one of enjoyment, but rather one of intrigue and unsettling suspense. In handwritten notes, Lehman sketched out that the sequence would define the first third of the movie. The blind man would visit Disneyland, and while in Frontierland, he would observe a gunfight between Sheriff Lucky and some of the resident bad guys. For a reason that Lehman would later develop, the murderer would also have been manipulated into visiting Disneyland on that same day. While watching a gunfight, outside of the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, the blind man, in a state of lucid imagery, would see the day when the eye donor himself was shot in a similar fashion. This prophetic vision would send a momentary note of terror into the blind man's soul. And then across the way, he would see the murderer standing in Frontierland, the man who, a moment earlier in his dreamy vision, he had seen holding a gun in a gloved hand. Though now, of course, his hands were empty, much like any tourist in the park. It would be a subliminal message, an image passed from the tissue of the eyes to the consciousness of the blind man, a vision that had a deep quality of meaning that the blind man could not ignore.
We now see a sign outside the facade of a bank. Bank robbery. Still in Disneyland, Larry and Jenny stand in a group waiting for the staged robbery to take place. Larry, glancing over his shoulder, sees Victor Farmer standing on the edge of the crowd. Larry turns away with a slightly troubled expression.
Here we go. This is it.
A man wearing a black mask over his eyes backs out of the bank, brandishing a revolver in one hand and a bulging sack of money in the other. He looks about wildly, then turns and runs away from the bank, hurtling past Larry and Jenny as he escapes. A uniformed guard comes dashing in pursuit. He pulls a handgun from the holster at his belt. Larry watches, wide-eyed.
Stop or I'll shoot! Stop!
No, don't.
Suddenly, there's terror on Larry's face.
Don't shoot.
He is no longer seeing the guard. Instead, he sees a vision of Victor Farmer holding a gun in a gloved hand and aiming it directly towards him.
No, don't!
Larry, what is it? Tell me.
After sweating out those initial handwritten notes the following day, Lehman phoned Hitch's office, where he talked to his assistant, who thought it was a good concept for a film. It wouldn't follow in the path of Psycho. It would be a big-budget picture with top-level actors like Jimmy Stewart, also a film more focused on the suggestion of violence than graphic depictions on screen. His assistant then called Hitch in Paris, where he was promoting the European release of Psycho. From there, a formal contract was assembled between Hitch's company and Lehman's agent to begin script work on a new film. Though the contract period wouldn't officially begin until November 1st, Lehman continued to rough out ideas for this story. He didn't have a name for the lead character, at least not yet. So in his notes, he simply referred to the blind man as Jimmy, after the actor who he believed would play him on screen. For a Hitchcock script, the story presented many cinematic possibilities. Hitch often used the camera to present an emotional approximation of a protagonist's reality, panning, tracking, tilting, and arranging the shots with sophisticated lens work. A blind man who slowly recovers sight would give Hitch opportunities to visually enhance scenes to evoke the perception of how a blind man would first experience color, shapes, and even light on screen. It also allowed for the possibility that during climactic sequences, the blind man might find his vision would fail or partially fail if the transplant wasn't fully successful. The blind man, of course, would be more at home in the dark than other characters. For a script by Lehman, it presented a set of circumstances, though well disguised, that were similar to those of his previous Hitchcock film, North by Northwest. North by Northwest told the story of an average, if successful, middle-upper-class single man who was drawn into a conspiracy through a case of mistaken identity. International spies mistook him for a federal agent with secrets. That is, the crime story lay mostly outside of the protagonist's life. The Blind Man would present the story of a somewhat average, if successful, middle-upper-class single man who was drawn into a conspiracy through the eyes he received through an organ transplant. As before, the crime story would lay outside of his life as well. The Blind Man would be a professional pianist, based on the life of George Shearing, a British jazz musician who was born without sight. By the late 1950s, Shearing found fame with songs like Lullaby in Birdland and September in the Rain, and for fronting his own jazz quartet which mixed jazz with bebop. Though, according to Lehman, Shearing once had the opportunity for a procedure that might give him sight, he refused because he felt that sight might diminish his other senses, which were more closely tied to music. Though the Blind Man didn't yet have a name other than Jimmy, the Blind Man's name in a later version of the script notes would be surprisingly close to that of Shearing. He would be Keating, Larry Keating, and in a draft of one scene he would also perform Lullaby in Birdland, as though to solidify this connection to the real-life pianist. As Lehman worked on script notes, he explored how to use Disneyland more fully in the story. The murderer might take the Blind Man, a.k.a. Larry Keating, now with sight, through the park looking for an opportunity to create another unfortunate accident. Larry Keating might play the keyboard for the first time in public with sight while at the park. The concept that Disneyland, as a place of safety and fantasy, could be recast as a place of danger appears strong in these early story notes. That is, the presentation of place was designed to subvert emotions that most viewers would associate with the park. But the Disneyland sequence was only one dramatic element that Lehman wrestled with in those early days. Lehman knew that for a large-budget picture from a major studio, the film would also need to include a love interest, in which Keating and the girl at times would be threatened by the killer. On October 12th, fairly early in his development process, he landed on one of the key plot ideas that would arrange the story as he moved forward. For much of these early notes, the girl remained more of an idea than a character. It could be a wife, a secretary secretly in love with him, or a nurse whose job it was to care for him as he recovered from the experimental eye surgery. There was also this problem. How could he force all of these characters together since they didn't know each other well? His solution to this question was relatively straightforward. After the Blind Man has the vision of the murder while at Disneyland, he learns by way of investigation that his eyes are somehow connected to the man he saw at the park and also to a woman in Pasadena, both of whom are planning to cruise to Hawaii later that week. The Blind Man, again urged on by the unsettling vision, would follow them onto the cruise ship, where they would, by the nature of the cruise experience, be forced together repeatedly, which is where most of the drama in the later acts would be focused. By the end of October, Lehman's ideas were still loose. There was the brilliant conceit at the center of the script that the Blind Man would receive the eyes of a man who had been murdered, and that the Blind Man, after seeing a staged gunfight at Disneyland, would have a disturbing vision of the actual murder scene. But around this narrative centerpiece, other concepts kept shifting. Even by the start of November, Lehman didn't yet have a handle on the motivation behind the original murder. At times he considered that it might be related to insurance money, to a crime of passion, or even to international espionage. Starting in November, Lehman regularly met with Hitch at his office at the Paramount lot to work through story points out of which he would create the script. It was similar to their development work for North by Northwest, only in those early weeks, Lehman struggled to find deep clarity as to how the plot points would arrange themselves into a continuous story. It was a set of compelling scenes: Disneyland, the gunfight, the cruise, a final scene likely shrouded in darkness, all of which needed to be stitched together. In this, there were a number of dramatic problems to overcome. What was the protagonist's motivation beyond a nagging curiosity to follow a murderer onto a cruise ship to solve the case? Beyond that, Lehman still didn't know the murderer's motivation for the initial crime. The killer eventually would have the name Victor Farmer, but at this time, in extensive notes, Lehman referred to the killer as either the Heavy or as a David Niven-type character, just as he identified the lead in his notes as Jimmy after the actor Jimmy Stewart. He also identified the killer, moving forward, as David, as though these characters were forever attached to those actors who first appeared in Lehman's imagination. Though a number of Hitchcock's early films, such as Sabotage, The 39 Steps, and Foreign Correspondent, focused on political plots in which villains were motivated by national ideologies, his later films slanted more toward desire, fear, and psychosis, as though by this point in his life he was beginning to believe that personal ambitions were more powerful than ones pertaining to a national identity. With this, Hitch backed away from Lehman's suggestion that the killer, a.k.a. David, a.k.a. Victor Farmer, might be attached to a plot to kill a spy as an enemy of the state. Hitch also backed away from Lehman's idea that the killer might be a Nazi war criminal in hiding, trying to protect his covert identity. Instead, Hitch suggested a personal motivation, greed or love or guilt, as impetus behind the killing. Throughout November, during regular meetings, they agreed on the overall shape of the story. The protagonist would initially question if he should have the transplant, as he feared that sight might damage his music. He also might be concerned that his fame was partially tied to his disability. He was a blind man who played the piano. With sight, he might just be like hundreds of other professional jazz pianists. He would then have the transplant go to Disneyland and see the gunfight, which would affect him on a subliminal level. They began to work out motivation for a range of characters. Why was the killer at Disneyland at the same time as the blind man? Lehman found a solution for this, as the initial killing led to an insurance payment. An insurance investigator could surreptitiously send a note to the killer demanding he be at Disneyland with the hope that once he saw the protagonist's eyes, it would unnerve him to the point where, with suspicion, he would act in a way that revealed his guilt. But the chance meeting between the killer and the protagonist, with all the looking and staring, ultimately unnerved both men to an extent where the blind man believed he knew some dark secret about the killer, and the killer believed that the blind man was pursuing him, perhaps in relation to the insurance payment, or perhaps it was a trick developed by law enforcement. Those elements of motivation would help advance the story, giving reason for the blind man to follow the killer and another character, the dead man's wife, onto the ship later in the story. For me, what's fascinating in looking over these story notes is the creative process of Hitch and Lehman. Though they saw large set pieces, Disneyland in particular, with clarity, much of their discussion is focused on inventing character motivation that would allow these scenes to exist. There would need to be a motive for the killer, aka David, aka Victor, to commit the first murder. There would need to be a motive to get both Victor and the blind man, aka Jimmy, aka Larry, to Disneyland at the same time. There would need to be a motive for both Victor and Larry to suspect each other of something that threatened them. There would need to be, beyond that, a motive for Victor to move toward a second murder once they were all on that ship. That is, for the movie to work in the second half, Larry must feel that his life, or something important in his life, was in jeopardy. In this, Hitch and Lehman struggled for weeks to find the right answer. In all of this, just two set pieces remain constant: the trip to Disneyland, in which Larry was accompanied in later drafts by his nurse, and the sea voyage. But even here, Hitch and Lehman struggled to find the right location. At times, Hitch considered a voyage from the East Coast that would lead to Europe, but in terms of consolidating the drama around one city, the Pacific voyage to Hawaii was more practical if they wanted to include the Disneyland segment. One of the unique elements through all of these notes, through the various versions of the story, is how central Disneyland remains to the story. Virtually all other elements, except for the eye surgery, have multiple iterations. The ship goes to Europe or to Hawaii, in one clipping possibly Australia. Likewise, in some versions, the killer is a spy, or he's in love with the widow, or he's in love with the stepdaughter. But the shootout at Disneyland and the subliminal vision never really change, as though these are the dramatic center points around which all other scenes would need to adjust. In late January, Lehman drafted out some scenes with full dialogue and arranged others with dense description. But as development progressed, Lehman admitted that he couldn't see a reasonable path forward to define character motivation issues central to the story. Larry's motivation was loose at best. He wanted to somehow confirm his suspicion that his vision of that killing was connected to the man he first saw at Disneyland, although in the real world it would be possible for him to simply walk away from this point of curiosity, unless it was driven by some deeper impulse. The script still needed a way to expand this curiosity into a personal terror or a crusade that would involve the essence of Larry's personality. But by the end of February, Lehman decided to put the script aside, believing that over time, one of them would arrive at a point where they could connect the scenes with greater direction. But there's another story here, one that almost surely involves Walt Disney. In the grand echo chamber of the internet, there's a story that has circulated and recirculated in which Walt personally put an end to the Blind Man project, as he wouldn't let Hitch film at his park after seeing, quote, that disgusting movie Psycho. In this same quote, he also says that he wouldn't let his children see the film. I have looked for the source of that quote in literally thousands of original documents, but I've never found it. I should point out that it's possible that Walt said that in a minor trade journal that has since disappeared from library shelves. But the tone and word use, at least to me, don't sound like Walt. I have trouble seeing Walt calling a movie from a rival studio disgusting, regardless of his personal feelings. Also, by this time, Walt's kids are grown adults. His older daughter, Diane, even has kids of her own. I suspect that this is not an exact quote, and that in the cut-and-copy world of the internet, people have just copied this quote over and over without looking for its original source. But something like this, probably with different language, did happen. I can even point to when it happened. There was almost surely an exchange between Lehman and Walt, or at least the people at the studio, about the possibility of shooting a sequence at Disneyland early in the development process. In the second half of October 1960, Lehman began to research elements of the script. He contacted surgeons in New York to better understand the process of an experimental eye transplant operation. He explored the life of blind pianist George Shearing, and at the same time, while he was working out how to realistically develop the script, there are odd questions that, on October 23rd, first appear in his notes. He began to question how to shoot that pivotal scene at Disneyland if Disney itself was not open to their production. This suggests that at some point during the previous week, he had reason to question the viability of using Disneyland as a location. Much later in his life, in an interview, Lehman would talk about why he abandoned The Blind Man after working on it for months. Quote, "Intriguing as my story was," he said, "I was running into seemingly insurmountable plot difficulties. Instead of beating my head against the obstacles until I broke them, I started quietly looking for exit doors. Then, one fateful day, Walt, after viewing Psycho, announced to the press that he would never let his children see that film, much less allow its director to shoot a picture in his amusement park. That announcement became one of the straws that broke a writer's back, the other being the writer's philosophy that when the story going got too tough, the tough got going, through the nearest exit. Later around Christmas time, I gritted my teeth and with all kinds of apologies for my ineptitude, told Hitch I was abandoning the project and moving on to other ventures, which disappointed him immensely. He later added, quote, "I must say I wish he or someone had locked the doors and told me I couldn't leave because I still think it was a good idea. And with Hitch and me hanging into the bitter end, I might have licked the screenplay." And with his visual imagination brought to play and the experiences of a blind man seeing the world for the first time, it could have been a memorable film. There's also a contemporary idea here that Walt may not have liked the idea of gunplay being associated with his park, but that's not it either. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the streets of Frontierland were host to a daily stunt show of sorts, in which the sheriff and various outlaws battled it out with guns while guests lined the road. This, of course, would never happen today, in a world of regular public shootings and security screenings outside the park. And those guns in Frontierland, of course, were loaded with blanks. But I think what most people would find surprising today is that gun demonstrations at Disneyland didn't always include blanks. For those dramatic shootouts, of course they included blanks. But park culture in the 1950s and early 1960s was in ways very different than it is today. In 1956, Disneyland hired Herb Parsons, an exhibition shooter for the Winchester Western Corporation, to give a multi-day exhibition at the park. In the 1950s, Parsons toured the country to demonstrate his sharpshooting ability with multiple guns, typically 16, and was routinely joined on stage by his sons, Len, who at the time was 13, and Jerry, who was 10, both of whom fired at targets as well. Parsons was a national skeet champion, shooting clay from the sky with stunning accuracy. For his exhibitions, he'd typically throw multiple discs into the air and hit each one before it fell to the ground. He was featured in Hollywood westerns, and he performed at Disneyland multiple times in 1956 on March 13th, 15th, and 18th, where he shot rifles and also talked about gun safety. The official press release reads, quote, "Disneyland brings Herb Parsons, one of the world's greatest trick shooters, to the park Tuesday for a spectacular shooting exhibition. Parsons, called the Wizard with a Winchester, will perform a rapid succession of amazing feats while he gives a running commentary of his program. Parsons is the former winner of the Pacific International Trap Shoot with a record of 399 out of 400 targets, and winner of the 1954 Professional Championship at the Grand American Handicap." So Disney's concern about the Hitchcock film had nothing to do with the presentation of guns at his park. Rather, it was likely about the type of film that would be made there. In that 1962 interview with Walt, mentioned in last week's episode, Walt specifically references the request from Hitchcock to shoot at Disneyland. The interview took place about a year and a half after Hitch and Lehman were developing the Blind Man script. The reporter, Erskine Johnson, sets up the quote in the following manner, with Walt explaining that, quote, "Half a dozen producers, including Alfred Hitchcock, were eager to use the giant playpen as a background for Murder." Then the journalist quotes Walt as to the reason why he didn't lend the park for such projects. Quote, "People," Walt said, "aren't ever murdered at Disneyland." There was no ill will between Disney and Hitch over this exchange. It was just a business decision. In fact, from reading through a couple hundred pages of notes, I suspect that Hitch and Lehman, while working on the story, had a two-step plan for this problem. Once the script was finished, they could ask Walt to read it, so he could see that the project was far more in line with North by Northwest, a movie with suspense, and would avoid the graphic violence included in Psycho. Lehman also mentioned specifically the possibility of simply shooting near Disneyland to include the idea of Walt's Park, and maybe beyond that, as a last area that I'm merely speculating about based on the script material, they might have been able to shoot the western scene at Knott's Berry Farm because the shootout in those later notes is arranged as the type of bank robbery, which was far more in line with the western show once performed at Knott's Berry Farm than the show staged at Disneyland. Regardless of this exchange, relations between the people at Disney and those in Hitchcock's units remained so positive that Disney, in small ways, was actually involved in Hitch's next film, which was The Birds. Walt loaned out his longtime friend and head of Disney's special effects department, Ub Iwerks, to Hitch, so Hitch could use the Disney-developed sodium vapor process and a unique camera built on the Disney lot to blend foreground shots of actors against background shots of birds. In a world before green screens and computers, this process was the most effective in merging separate images into a single print, a process that would later become famous with Mary Poppins. So months after The Blind Man was shelved, Walt agreed to loan both Iwerks and also the one camera in the world that was uniquely designed to create shots that could be merged with this moving matte process to Hitchcock. The end result: flocks of birds realistically attacking residents of a small town just north of San Francisco for another big Hitchcock hit. But in all of this, it is certainly clear that Walt had a sensitivity to how the public would view and experience his park. He looked to his park, at least in part, as a play area where guests immersed themselves in a believable recreation of film, of the Wild West, of a turn-of-the-century America, of exotic jungles. In Lehman's script, the park lent itself to a type of postmodern discourse. It was a film arranged in a park that was designed to look like other films. It was a hallway of mirrors in which the viewer questioned what they were ultimately looking at. The cowboy wasn't just a cowboy, but somehow a reference to a modern-day murderer. Guests weren't friendly co-participants in play, they were something to be feared. In the Hitchcock movie, the safety that designers had carefully layered into the park was also an illusion, as there was a type of palpable danger swirling around guests, even though the blind man was the only one able to sense those dangers that lay just beneath the surface. This type of film, as Walt likely pointed out, wasn't a project for him. Throughout his life, he would want his park to remain as a safe escape for people who in the 1950s and 1960s were finding increasing amounts of stress and anxiety at home, at work, and even around town. Before I go, a few things. The dramatization excerpted in this week's episode comes from a BBC audio presentation of The Blind Man. To the best of my knowledge, there was no finished shooting script for this Hitchcock project. From reading through story development notes, I'm fairly sure that the BBC took the story and scene notes from January 1961 and then hired a contemporary screenwriter to connect them with new material, developing linking drama to connect scenes and scene concepts originated by Lehman and Hitchcock. It runs just under 90 minutes, so it presents most of the material that was finished at that time. But for a Hitchcock film from that era, it would likely have been a considerably longer picture if it had been shot. The first third of the script in the BBC production is fairly developed. It's the middle section pertaining to the cruise to Hawaii that likely would have been better developed before filming. But I'll leave a link in the production notes if you'd like to listen to it. It's an excellent presentation of the unproduced material. As always, I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. At least right now, the plan for next week is to explore how recent changes to the Jungle Cruise reshaped the attraction. I plan to spend some time this week going through that recently updated attraction. And over on our Bandcamp channel right now, you can find the recently posted audiobook that focuses on the life of Disney animator Dick Huemer from his early days in New York animation studios to his work on Snow White, Fantasia, and Dumbo. As you probably know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. If you enjoy these podcasts, if you find them a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.